Welcome to the NYREJ Podcast. I'm your host, Rick Kaplan. My guest today is Jim Cinelli, and he is with Liberty Environmental. And good morning, Jim.
Good morning, Rick. How are you?
I'm very good, thank you. Tell me a little bit about Jim, and tell me a little bit about Liberty Environmental.
Sure. Well, I'm an environmental engineer, and I've been in the environmental consulting industry for, going on 33 years. In 2004, I co-founded my company, Liberty Environmental. We're an environmental consulting firm. We're headquartered in Reading, Pennsylvania. We have 5 offices, 3 in Pennsylvania, 1 in New Jersey, and 1 in New York City. And we have a staff of about 40 people. Environmental consulting, it's a varied industry depending on your size, what type of clients you work for, and what kind of services you provide. We're fairly diversified at Liberty Environmental. First of all, our work is 99% private client work. We really don't do a whole lot of state or federal environmental contract work. So our clients are largely real estate owners, real estate developers, and we also have a side that works for manufacturing. So our real estate related services are doing investigations of soil and groundwater, determining if there's any kind of historical contamination, and if there is, our geologists and our engineers work together to devise some kind of plan to clean up the site. Typically, it's tied in with a redevelopment project when we're working in New York City, for instance. But a lot of times it's simply a gas station. One of their tanks, has a failure and there's a leak, and we investigate that. Or it could just be a standard transaction of a property where nobody knew it, but at one time, a number of years ago, there might have been a gas station, there might have been a dry cleaner. And so as part of the transaction from seller to buyer, we come in and we do an environmental investigation. And like I said, we also do work for manufacturers. It's probably about 30% of what we do. So large manufacturing firms across the country are our clients, and they've got numerous environmental regulations to comply with: air quality, water quality, stormwater, wastewater, waste management. So we assist manufacturers in complying with regulations. And really, the third major branch of what we do is natural resources. So for a new development in a greenfield area, we have biologists that do wetlands and endangered species surveys. So that, in a nutshell, is what Liberty Environmental does.
So when you go, so let's say someone's building a new project, and it's a old building that's there. They tear it all down. You go in and investigate what the ground is like, what's in the ground, and once they get everything cleared and they start the building process, do you go back year after year and then reevaluate the land again?
It depends on what remediation was performed, what contaminants might still be there and are just being managed in place under engineering controls and deed restrictions on a property. It also depends from state to state what the requirements are. Our work is largely in Pennsylvania, New York, and New Jersey, and their environmental cleanup regulations are vastly different among the 3 states. So if you're redeveloping a site and your excavation for the basement tackles all of the contamination there's no strings attached. You get your approval to clean up. There's nothing to be done in the future. But a lot of times there's residual contamination, and there's an obligation sometimes to operate and maintain a mitigation system. And yes, there's periodic reporting, typically an annual report that gets submitted to the state environmental agency. And some of the systems are large, sophisticated systems. Some of them are very small, simple systems. For instance, I would say, you know, 80% or more of the redevelopment projects that we work on in New York City have some kind of vapor intrusion barrier or even a fan that makes sure that any kind of vapors that are coming from groundwater are not getting into the building and posing a health threat to building occupants. So these systems are relatively simple as engineered remediation systems go. Subslab depressurization systems, we call them, very similar to a radon system on a home. Need constant maintenance and inspection and reporting to the state. So it can go anywhere from there to you know, a large scale system that might be treating substantial contamination and might have to run for 5 years or 10 years or further. Some of the projects we work on are landfill Superfund sites that aren't going to be cleaned up really practically for 50 or 100 years because they're so big and they're so contaminated. And things typically go slow when you're getting approvals from the federal government. So I tell people we work on anything from the smallest mom and pop gas station cleanup sites to substantial landfill Superfund sites overseen by EPA and the Army Corps of Engineers.
You know, it's funny you brought up radon, and I sold a house many years ago that was probably built in the 60s.
Mm-hmm.
And when I bought it, there was no test or anything for radon, but there was a lot of construction that went on down the street. And they said due to the construction down the street, it changes the ground, what's in the ground. It moves things around, and that is what probably created the radon. I don't know if it was true or not because they were trying to sell me, but
it's, you know, it depends on the type of geology that you're in. It depends on the amount of disturbance they're creating. If they're blasting and you're in a geologic formation where there's, you know, large fractures and fissures and maybe some voids, then sure, that's very possible. It can state agencies in particular when they're doing highway projects, or let's say oil and gas companies that are doing pipeline projects have to be very cautious and have to monitor homes, wells that are in close proximity to the construction site to make sure there isn't any adverse impact.
Now let's talk about water.
Sure.
You said you have to check out the groundwater. I'm assuming that are there. What about also the water that would be coming into the project or the buildings? Was that something you'd be inspecting as well?
Yeah, no, not really. Like I said, we don't do a whole lot of government work. Government agencies are responsible for conducting frequent analysis on their water supplies, making sure they comply with state and federal water quality regulations under the Safe Drinking Water Act. It's not. We have done water supply work for industrial clients because a number of them are located in remote areas where there isn't public water. So we're doing sampling and analysis and permitting and installation of water treatment systems. We have a very large food client that has large mushroom operations. They have probably 20 or 30 water supply wells throughout their mushroom farms, and because they're in a heavily farmed area, they're constantly seeing issues with nitrates and bacteria. So we're constantly working on relatively small treatment systems for those clients. But we have done, you know, larger systems for Superfund sites, for groundwater treatment of industrial chemicals as well. We don't work for you know, New York City or Philadelphia or any major water suppliers like that, but they tend to have their own staff that do their monitoring. And one thing that's new, I'm going to call it new, even though the chemicals have been around since the 1940s. Thing that's really challenging to some of our clients, and that's becoming a substantial line of business for us, are these forever chemicals. PFAS. I'm not sure if you've heard of this. In the last couple of years, the movie came out with Mark Ruffalo, and It's called dark waters, and it's all about these impacts from these forever chemicals that are now showing up in water supplies and wastewater discharges all over the place. And these are have determined to be highly toxic, so their cleanup levels are very low in the parts per trillion range. So we have been seeing a substantial amount of work in the last 2 years, especially in investigating sites for PFAS groundwater contamination and devising a plan to treat the groundwater or to treat water supplies for these contaminants.
Now, go back to the groundwaters. Some places require you to have a well. So the water coming into the facility would be well water that is not considered run by any kind of state office or government office. So how would you set something like that up?
Again, this varies by state, but generally speaking, if you are a business, you are not a community public water supply, but you are a non-community public water supply. So you still have to go through the testing and permitting of that well with the state environmental agency. And like I said, we do a good number we do a good amount of work on a number of systems that are not public as most people think of public water supplies, because they're called non-community. They're businesses that have water supplies that serve customers and their employees. So they're still regulated. And they have to meet the same water quality standards as a municipal water supply.
Now, with all these new life science labs and offices that are being built all over the place, there's a lot of regulations that go into these places, because there's a lot of, I would assume they call them clean rooms still. So the air quality, excuse me, the air quality in the building has to be probably, stellar, I would think.
Sure.
And how do you maintain something like that? Because with all the pollutions around the world.
Sure. I'm going to be honest. That we don't dive into indoor air quality. We partner with industrial hygiene firms that have certified industrial hygienists that specialize in that area. But occasionally we step a little bit into that arena. Healthcare facilities, pharmaceutical facilities have very low tolerance for any kind of pollutants in their water and in their air. So yeah, you see even other industries like semiconductor manufacturers, they have to have impeccable air and water quality. So they have they have clean rooms where they're getting down to a particle of dust per 10,000 or 100,000 cubic feet of air. And sometimes they need ultra pure water systems that are going through not just primary or secondary, but tertiary treatment, so that the water is ultra pure. And that's all I can speak about, because I'm not there's typically mechanical and process engineers that are designing those. But in a previous life with another company, we had a division that worked for the semiconductor industry, and it's really interesting to see the kind of projects that they work on.
Well, that's fair enough. But now, so you said you also do water retention areas, or land conservation areas. Isn't that?
Yeah, that's true. We get involved with streams and wetlands. So it's great when we can recycle old brownfields, but the truth is, we need to keep building, and we build in areas that are previously undeveloped. And it is so we do work on highway projects. Obviously, highways, there's always new bridge replacements, road widening, and new roads. So our biologists will head out to the site and kind of pre-clear those areas to make sure that what they're proposing to build isn't going to impact any wetlands or endangered species habitat. And if they are, or if there's a possibility, we work with the civil engineers designing a highway project to devise a plan that's acceptable to the state and federal environmental agencies, so the project can move through. A lot of what we've been doing in the natural resources arena in the last 5 to 10 years has been interstate warehouse projects. They're popping up. A few head out of New York through New Jersey into Pennsylvania and into Virginia on I-78 and I-81. There are hundreds of new warehouses, and a lot of these warehouses are just, it used to be 500,000 square feet was a big warehouse, and then it was 1 million. And I think the most recent project was the big building was 1.3 million square feet. And there are a couple other buildings that have 1 million square feet. There's a demand for bigger building footprints, and just think about it. The bigger your footprint is, the harder it is to steer around the streams and wetlands. So it's become more challenging, and larger projects that we get involved in now. When there's a massive footprint for a building, there's no way to avoid all the streams and wetlands, and so we work with the state agencies. We follow their guidance in mitigating those impacts to streams and wetlands. So we're doing the field surveys, and then we're doing the engineering of a relocated stream or a mitigated wetland. And you talked about ongoing monitoring. When you create a man-made wetland to replace a natural one that you disturbed, we've got to be out there every 3 months for 5 years to make sure that wetland is coming up and achieving the environmental benefit that it was designed to. Because plants don't always take the way you want them to, and so sometimes there's you've got to go out and do some reconstruction of areas. So the interstate warehouse projects have been a really big part of our natural resources work for the last several years.
Well, that's all right. It gives you some longevity with the client too, because you're going to keep going out there.
Yeah, we like that. We like those long-term projects. We do one-off projects that we're in there and we're out in a month, and other projects that we're there for 5 years, 10 years. What I like about how our business has grown since we started it 19 years ago is that we are diverse in the services that we provide and in the clients that we serve. So in times of economic downturns, like the economic downturn in 2008, and the commercial real estate difficulties that we're seeing now, our numbers stay relatively level because our services are spread among a lot of different industries.
Now, with all this new construction along the coastline and the issues of like salt water and mixing with groundwater and things like that, how do you go into how do they build all these buildings without having that saltwater mix and on that foundation? That's something that must be difficult.
Well, here's as far as sea level rise and saltwater intrusion, there's one big headache that public water suppliers are going to have to deal with, and that's when they're not groundwater sources but surface water sources. The saltwater line moving further up the river, and the water supply intake now pulling in brackish or salty water. That could be a substantial problem. The other problem, which I read a really interesting article about a couple of weeks ago, I believe it was in the Wall Street Journal, about some farmers in Spain and Italy. And one farm in Spain cannot grow what they had been growing for probably a century or more because of the saltwater intrusion. So they're switching crops. So farmers are needing to pivot in some areas, and it's difficult because farmers have one bad season, and they're looking at serious financial hardships, and to just switch a crop isn't something that happens like that. So it's an interesting problem that farmers are having, I guess, all over the world. Sea level rise, and in Italy, it was an interesting story, but they were shifting crops. they're in northern Italy, they're growing tomatoes where they never did before. In southern Italy, they're growing mangoes where they never grew them before. So, it's a very interesting story. But sea level rise and more frequent floods with global warming is a substantial challenge. One of the services that we started providing about 2 years ago is in energy efficiency auditing and retro commissioning studies, and particularly in New York City, where Local Law 97 has imposed caps of greenhouse gas emissions for most buildings 50,000 square feet and larger. And that first cap applies to those buildings and their greenhouse gas emissions in 2023. So at the end of this year, those buildings will have to run calculations and submit a report to the city. And if they exceed their cap, they pay penalties. There will be a relatively small amount of buildings that are going to be paying penalties, but that cap drops substantially in 2030. And a lot of buildings, we're talking about thousands of buildings, will need to do something between now and then to improve their energy efficiency, reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, or they could see substantial 5-figure, 6-figure annual penalties. So it's a very interesting space to be in. I've learned a little bit about it. We have a specialist on our staff that does that energy efficiency work, and I see that as probably the most potential for growth in our industry.
Yeah, and last week I did an interview with a gentleman that was he was an engineer as well, but he would go and inspect garages that were, to make sure that the structure was sound.
Okay.
And, after the building in Florida collapsed, and I guess in New York, there was also a building that collapsed many years ago. But, it was something that I never knew, and I just trusted it was going on, is that none of these buildings were ever inspected for structural changes. And, when you go into a parking garage that's under a building that might be 50 stories high and it's never been inspected after 10 or 15 years with all the salt, and especially that's why I ask about the salt water, being right next to the coast. It's very easy for these buildings to corrode, the concrete and the steel, everything.
Yeah, it's highly corrosive, and it's sad that you need a tragedy like the one that happened in Florida a couple of years ago to have people really look at their codes and regulations, and rewrite them, make them more strict. I know property owners don't like it, but if it prevents building collapse and save lives, it's clearly needed.
That's why I'm bringing it up, because I would think that not before, if someone can build a structure now, someone like you would have to go into that and figure out what's in that soil that they're building on, first off, and what are the potentials of the air quality from like salt water affecting the building, or even salt getting into the groundwater affecting that building.
In our case, salt in the air and salt in water, it's not a regulated pollutant. But certainly, if we're working in a coastal area and somebody is proposing a public water supply, whether it's a surface water intake, which are fairly rare, to be proposed on the types of sites that we work. We're typically working with groundwater, but as you get to coastal areas, salinity and dissolved solids could be a critical parameter that would need to be treated, and that's not an inexpensive treatment. That is going beyond our traditional treatment that we do on water supplies and getting into what we call tertiary treatment. And when you have to use reverse osmosis or a similar system like that, it's costly. It's a lot of maintenance, and then you have reverse osmosis works by under pressure, water goes through a filter and it comes out clean, but then you have 50% left that's highly concentrated dissolved solids, and you've got to dispose of that. So now you have environmental problem to solve number two, getting rid of that highly concentrated wastewater. So it can be a substantial challenge.
Now, are there any other issues that you run into all the time that property owners have to be aware that they're going to have the cost of removing this, either air or water or just the soil in itself?
Yeah, well, people need to understand in some cases, and most experienced real estate developers, understand, but there's plenty of people out there that are buying the one and only commercial property they'll ever buy, or they're not a large developer, they're a smaller developer, and so new things pop up that they don't anticipate. But when we do investigation of the property, we look at old historical information going back to the late 1800s. And a lot of times people aren't aware that a property had some kind of industrial use or a gas station in the 1930s and 1940s. We can't write it off just because it was so long ago. So we need to go beyond just the visual inspection and go out there and start collecting samples. There's also, like I said, there are regulations that are different everywhere you go. Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, and in New York City, they have their own remediation program. They have the Mayor's Office of Environmental Remediation, City Hall, and that was created, I think about 20 years ago now, because of the massive rezoning that has been done across the city to now allow residential use in areas that were formerly just zoned for commercial industrial. So the city has its environmental quality mandate, as the state of New York does as well. And before you rezone an area, you need to see what the impacts could be, environmental impacts from not just soil and groundwater contamination, but noise and air quality. So the city has a very progressive program, and they call it the E-designation program. So when they're doing this rezoning, they'll slap an E-designation on a property, and that's something that again could take a property owner by surprise, because it's not just doing a voluntary environmental investigation under typical due diligence, but it's a mandatory full-blown phase 1 and phase 2 investigation. And a lot of times the environmental consultant needs to be on site during construction. Not all construction, but during excavation. But we could be out there for a month, 2 months, 6 months, depending on the size of the project. So it's an added cost, but the city is protective of its citizens, and the state and city both want to make sure that because of problems that have occurred for many years, that contaminated soil that's being excavated is going someplace that's legally permitted to accept it, and it's not being dumped in somebody's backyard or a swamp somewhere.
Jim, if someone wanted to get a hold of you to find out how they can figure out what damage their property has on it before they start any construction, how would they get a hold of you?
Well, they could learn more about Liberty and get a hold of us through our website at www.libertyenviro.com. My email address is jcinelli, JCINELLI, at libertyenviro.com. Or call our 800 number, the old-fashioned way. Reach out to us by phone, and we'd be happy to talk to anybody about any kind of environmental challenge they're facing and help them through the process.
And what is your geographical area that you cover?
We say generally on real estate types of projects from Washington, D.C. to Connecticut. Our work that we do for manufacturing firms, because that's all done behind a desk and it doesn't really involve field work, we do work for companies across the country, probably 30 different states. But for our real estate related services, we feel that to be price competitive and to provide good quality service, we really need to be within a 2-hour radius. So DC to Connecticut is our general service area.
Great. Well, thank you for coming on the show. We're talking with Jim Cinelli of Liberty Environmental. Again, thank you, Jim. It's been very interesting to talk with you. And
Thanks very much, Rick. It's been a pleasure.
it's been my pleasure. And I want to wish everyone till next time. Okay. And that's
Great.
it.